One of the experiences I trust every homebrewer shares is the feeling of awe that comes from witnessing the conversion of wort into beer through the fermentation process. Even after 15 years, I still get giddy when I see the first signs of airlock activity, a nice fluffy kreuzen developing on top of my beer. The worst is when this takes too long. You all know the anxiety that comes from checking on a batch a day after pitching and seeing no action. This is why we love Imperial Yeast, who pack 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch-right pouch, which assures quick starts, healthy fermentation, and predictably great results. I strongly urge all of our listeners to check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and let them know that you appreciate their support of the Brülosophy podcast while you're at it. All right, on to the show. After purchasing my very first homebrew kit back in 2003, I spent a few hours researching the brewing process online, which at the time wasn't nearly as robust as it is these days, but it helped guide my approach. Despite my first handful of batches being extract with steeping grains, they took quite a bit of time for me to brew for various reasons. Since then, I've brewed hundreds upon hundreds of batches, the vast majority of which have been all grain, which arguably requires an even greater investment of time, though through my years of experience, I've come up with a bunch of ways to make the process a bit more streamlined. You're listening to the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to discuss our experiences brewing with time constraints is contributor and host of the Brülosophy Show on YouTube, Martin Keane.
Yeah, I really think one inhibitor to brewing is just this perceived lack of time, right? Oh, I don't have hours and hours for a brew day today. I'll put it off. Or I can't wait a month for my beer to be ready, So the thing is, you mentioned you've brewed hundreds of batches of beer. I've brewed hundreds of batches of beer as well. We both have a family, we have full-time jobs, we have other things to do, but we've found ways to speed things up and fit brewing into our everyday lives. So I'm really looking forward to getting into this today.
Yeah, absolutely. I sort of feel like the title of this episode is a little bit of a misnomer because I employ most of the methods we're going to be talking about as a matter of course with every batch I brew, but coming up with good titles for this stuff can be kind of difficult at times. So especially when we're sort of known for the whole short and shoddy thing. I mean, we're definitely going to be talking about that series, but our hope for this episode is more specifically to go over just the stuff related to our brewing process that has helped us to, like you said, kind of expedite the brewing process to make it less of a hassle. And we're going to provide more details on how we save time when we're brewing overall. So, I mean, as my grandpa said, time is money, boys. So get off your bohunkus and get to work. All right. If you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brülosophy over at patreon.com/Brülosophy, where you make a small monthly pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up this month, November of 2023, Matthew Harold from the Mean Brews YouTube channel will be hanging out with patrons. If you're unfamiliar with Mean Brews, you've got to go check it out now. The name is not based on Matthew's temperament. I promise you, he is a very kind person. Rather, it's in reference to the approach he takes to designing recipes. Basically, after evaluating a bunch of existing award-winning recipes, Matthew averages out the ingredients to develop a sort of penultimate recipe for that style. This explanation does not do it justice. You got to go check it out. It really is very cool. It's the Mean Brews YouTube channel. See what Matthew's up to. It's really, really rad. Matthew's going to be taking questions on Saturday, November 25th, 2023. So be sure to make your pledge of just $3 or more over at patreon.com/Brülosophy by Friday the 24th. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page as well as our Patreon page so that patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brülosophy. Another really easy way to help us out is by using the links found at brülosophy.com/support when shopping online. Your experience won't change at all, and we get a little commission for the referral. With the holidays coming up, we would seriously appreciate you all taking the time to use these links when you're doing your online gift shopping. Finally, if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd appreciate that as well. Thanks to everybody out there who's already taken the time to rate and review the show. We read every single one of them and really appreciate your thoughts. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who are known for their incredible all-in-one electric brewing systems. I've brewed on both their 120 and 240 volt systems, and I'm telling you, these things are legit, efficient, easy to use with a relatively small footprint. You're not going to be disappointed with one of these units. Plus, the guys behind the company run an amazing YouTube channel, which you can find by searching YouTube for Clawhammer Supply. If you're in the market for electric brewing gear, make sure to check out what Clawhammer Supply has to offer at clawhammersupply.com, and don't forget to let them know Brülosophy sent you when you're checking out. That's clawhammersupply.com. Listener David, I think it's Muchi Grosso, reached out with even more feedback on our previous discussion about brewing as art and or science. David said, I just got to put in my 2 cents. I think brewing is like architecture. It's inextricably an art that uses the tools of science to do its work. You can build a shack without using much architecture, just like you can brew beer without having any kind of precise recipe in mind, but you're still making artistic decisions at every step along the way. An ugly basic shack is still an architectural style, just like a short and shoddy kitchen sink ale is also a brewing style, although neither is very aesthetically appealing. Likewise, the basic shack still needs some amount of science or engineering to stay standing. You put 2 sticks up against each other at the wrong angle and you don't have a shack. Same goes for the kitchen sink ale. If it doesn't have hops, grains, water, yeast in a specific scientifically defined process, it is not an ale.
I have been loving these endless discussions about this art versus science, and everybody has an opinion. It's just one of those things. Everybody has an opinion. I totally get that architecture comment.
Yeah.
And, I think one good way of sort of illustrating that is, the Brew Club have this average brew series where they set aside a list of things that everybody has to do. So these are the ingredients that you have to use. This is the process that you have to use and so forth. And yet the beers that come out of that are so very different. So the science of setting together the specifications is one thing, but how you go about doing it, that was the art part of it. There are just so many different ways you can approach it. So, yeast does a certain thing at a certain temperature for sure, but there's different ways that we can layer things on there to give it our own expression. And I think that's why it really is such an art as well as being a science.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Of all the feedback we've received so far on this topic, and like you said, Martin, it's an endless conversation. I didn't realize it would be such a popular topic. I do feel like David's is the one that most closely resembles my perspective on the matter. I've shared it a million times, so I won't belabor that point. But his shack analogy really hits the nail on the head, so to speak. You can't have brewing without either art or science. They are inextricably linked. So amen, David. Thank you so much for sharing your feedback with us. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brülosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. All right, time for a quick break. When we return, we're going to be discussing our experiences brewing with time constraints or just saving time on brew day. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brülosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Brewing is a process, no doubt, one that involves various steps that, if completely overlooked, could ultimately lead to a negative outcome. Preparation, water treatment, mashing, lautering, sparging, boiling, cleaning, chilling, sanitizing, fermenting, cold crashing, fining, packaging, and serving. To outsiders, it is understandably intimidating, and even for many who take the step to make their own beer at home, they end up not brewing often simply because of how arduous the process is. Today, our goal is to share some of the tips and tricks that we've developed over our many years of home brewing that have helped us to accomplish the task of making a batch of beer in a less time-consuming way, and arguably less stressful way as well. Now, regular listeners of the show are likely well aware of our Short and Shoddy series, where we brew various styles using a bunch of corner-cutting methods. While we will certainly be addressing most of those methods in this episode, I want to reiterate that our goal for this episode is to offer even more ideas, some of which aren't necessarily part of the whole Short and Shoddy thing. All right, as we've done in the past, we will be approaching this discussion in a sort of temporal way, starting with the pre-brew preparation. Martin, what are some of the things you do to prepare for a brew day that help you save time?
Right. I think the key thing here is to try and do a little bit of preparation ahead of the brew day. The worst thing that you could be doing here is doing each step, waiting for it to complete, then moving on to the next step. And the most obvious first step is collecting the water. Now, for me, I use a reverse osmosis system. So I am taking that water out of my tap and putting it into my brew kettle. And that process to collect enough water for a 5-gallon batch takes, I don't know, an hour or so. So I definitely don't want to be sat around on a day where I'm supposed to be brewing, waiting for the water to fill up into my kettle. So first things first is try to add the water ahead of time, the day before, a couple of days before, whatever. And also to measure out any water salts that I'm going to be using, and even potentially add them in ahead of the brew day.
Yeah, I'm the same way. Again, as a matter of course, my pre-brew day preparation, if we're going to call it that, involves collecting my water, treating my water. So I do use tap water, but I run it through a carbon filter. And so when I collect the full volume of water, and we're going to talk about full volume mashing here in a minute, but when I collect that water, I treat it with a little bit of either potassium or sodium metabisulfite, also known as Campton, just to knock out any remnant chlorine and chloramines so that I don't get that icky Band-Aid medicinal flavor in my beer. I don't like that. And then I also treat it with, or adjust it with my minerals to my desired mineral profile at this point. So this is all done the night before I brew or even the day before I brew. I remember back when I started prepping early like this, there was a lot of talk in particular about grains. Oh man, if you mill those grains and you wait overnight and they're just sitting in a bucket, they're going to stale and you're going to taste that in your beer. I have not had that issue, and I've made beers using this method where I've won awards or they've scored really well in competition. So that's another thing that I do is I'll measure out all of my grain and get them milled. And I'm a brew in a bag guy these days, and so one of the things I'll do is mill it right into the bag. That way, when I wake up the next morning, I've got my water all set, I've got my grains all set. All I got to do is turn the controller on or flip get the fire going on the burner, and I'm off to the races. And so that makes, you think about it, you're like, well, none of that stuff takes that much time. You could do your grain while you're heating your water up. You can, but for me, it makes it a lot more, a lot less stressful, or it feels less convoluted by getting it done ahead of time. Another thing that I do every brew day is the day before, I set up all my gear where exactly I want it to be. That sounds silly, but if I can set it all up to where I've got my fermenter is right over here, I know what I'm going to do with that. I'll usually put sanitizer in my fermenter the night before, so it's just sitting in there. Again, you cut out a lot of 1-minute things and you end up saving 15 or 20 minutes. And that's kind of my perspective on the whole thing.
Totally. I used to be so concerned about that pre-milling of grains that my brew day could not start until 11 a.m. on a given day, because I would go to the homebrew store, I would buy the grains, and I didn't have a grain mill when I first started, so I'd use the store grain mill. And I wanted to go straight from the homebrew store with my milled grains to immediately brewing. So I could not go to the homebrew store, say, the day before and get it, because then it's been milled and sat around for 24 hours. That would be unacceptable. So, and I ended up migrating from that to, I would just now go to the homebrew store and pick up a month's worth of ingredients if I was brewing every week, and I would get them all pre-milled, and some of that milled grain would then sit in my basement for a month before I used it, and I have never had a problem with pre-milling the grains. Yeah,
I'm in the same boat. In fact, what really, we're gonna refer to our personal experiences, which for me is mostly experiments that I've performed for the website. One of the experiences I had that really kind of proved to me that this idea of pre-milling and leaving your grains out isn't as bad as I'd been told they were is a local buddy of mine, came over to my house to participate in an experiment. This was probably 6 or 7 years ago. And he brought me a bag of milled grain that he didn't want to use because he thought they were going to be stale. And he's like, hey man, these are like 3 months old or whatever. I never got around to brewing this Scotch ale. Why don't you just figure out an experiment to do with it? So I held on to it for, I think, 2 or 3 more years, just sitting, and it gets hot here in Fresno. It was just sitting out in my garage. So, easily over 100 degrees for a couple of months out of the year for 2 or 3 years. And when I finally got around to doing it, I think I made a short and shoddy with it, in fact. But I just did a single batch. I didn't do a comparison, and the beer came out tasting perfectly fine. Now, I'm not claiming to be some like grandmaster BJCP judge, but I've judged a lot. I've drank a lot of beer. There was no staling. There was no bad flavors. It didn't taste like cardboard, nothing like that. So I have zero issues pre-milling my grain 12 hours before I mash in. That's not an issue. One of the things I do want to point out about preparation, though, that I thought was super duper helpful is I built myself a heat stick at one point. And so I would prep my water, and I went to the store, I went to Walmart, and I bought like this $12, plug-in timer, and I put my heat stick in this timer. You got to make sure all the voltage and all that stuff is proper. But I plugged it into that, and I would set it to turn on. It was a little 120 volt heat stick. I'd put it in the water and set it to turn on 2 hours before I woke up in the morning. So I would go out into my garage, and my strike water would be, my mash water would be almost to strike temperature. That's another really cool, again, to be able to wake up and just toss your grains right in the water. Pretty sweet.
Yeah, and I've been looking for the equivalent of that for the 240 volt systems. So I wanted to put some kind of timer on my 240 volt system in just a wall plug that would turn on at the right time and preheat, but I've never found a way to do that. Fortunately, with that sort of power, the heating element gets the water to strike temperature very quickly anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a really good point, especially if you are using a 120 volt system. It can take a long time to get to mash temperature. So why not have it just ready when you're ready to brew?
Yeah, exactly. And if you go to Amazon, for people who don't want to spend, an arm and a leg on a heat stick that some, homebrew shop has made for you, or if you don't want to make your own, which I'll be honest, it's kind of a pain in the butt because you got to make sure that the parts of this thing are completely sealed. Obviously, you don't want water getting in and it's electricity. You got to be careful with that. You can go to Amazon and just search for bucket heater. And you're not looking to bring this, your strike water or your mash water, your brewing liquor up to a boil. You're just looking to get it warmed up a couple of hours before you go out to brew without having to do anything. These bucket heaters, I think, are like $30. They're pretty cool. And I have a lot of friends who use those. And they're called bucket heaters because you can toss them in a plastic bucket with water and they'll heat the water up. So any other ideas for you in terms of preparing for your brew day before we move on to the mash step?
I find for me that it's very helpful to go around and make sure that the cameras are all turned on and the SD cards are formatted, but that may just be me.
That's true. Yeah. When we're, if we were to break down our actual brew day prep when we're brewing for Brülosophy, whether it's, a brew it yourself even, or an experiment especially, there's a little bit more involved in that. But what we're focusing on now, Martin, is what we would do if we're not brewing necessarily for Brülosophy. So talk to me a little bit about some of the stuff that you've done to, save time with the obviously we're going to hit on, abbreviating the mash rest, but there's other things we can do as well.
Right, and one of those is just a full volume mash. So I have an all-in-one system. It's a claw hammer system, and I always do full volume mashes, and that way I can skip performing a sparge, which is just more time. I mean, if you are using a sparge, you need to heat up some sparging water from a different heat source. Then you need to actually perform the sparge. It just takes time. With the no sparge full volume mash, you can just put all the water in, put all of the grains in, and then wait for however long you are willing to mash that for. So I think I've only ever performed a sparge once ever, and that was simply because I couldn't fit the amount of volume that I needed into my brew kettle. Right.
When I first started brewing all grain, this must have been, I think I brewed my first all grain batch in 2010. And so, 13 years ago or so, and I started off with batch sparge, and I'd never, at that point I was kind of new to the all grain world, and I had yet to hear of brew in a bag, at least brew in a bag proper as we refer to it nowadays. It was kind of just drilled into us that you have to sparge, you have to rinse those grains if you want to get all the sugars off of them, yada, yada. It wasn't until a couple years later that somebody had recommended to me just throwing everything in. I had the 70 quart cooler that I was using for my batch sparge process, throwing everything in together and seeing what would happen. And it was referred to as the no sparge method. I think I even wrote an article on it. And I was convinced, the quality of this beer just wasn't going to be as good, whatever. And that just wasn't the case. I honestly think that my predicted OG was 2 points lower than what I would get with batch sparge. So that didn't bother me at all. And the beer was fantastic in the end. So that was kind of started me on the path of doing this no sparge, which is great because you don't need 2 vessels to heat stuff up in. My process when I first started doing the batch sparge thing is I had one very large kettle that I would put my mash liquor in. I'd heat that up. I'd transfer it over to the grains in the mash tun. I'd then take my sparge water, put it in there, put it in the kettle, heat that up, and then I'd run off my first runnings into a bucket because I didn't have another kettle at the time. You see, it's just this convoluted thing. If you do it all at once, you just run it right off into the kettle and start your boil. It saves time. It's less convoluted. It's really easy. So I'm a big advocate for no sparge brewing. I guarantee there are people out there listening, rolling their eyes, swearing that no sparge creates a lower quality beer than batch or fly sparge. I disagree with that, but to each their own. Now, if you're opting to do batch or fly sparge, I think the easiest way to save a little bit of time is to just make sure that you're heating your sparge water while you're mashing, and then you start to heat your first runnings of sweet wort up to a boil while you're doing that sparge step, so that everything is in the process of getting hotter while you're doing other things. But
yeah, exactly. And then the other question, of course, is how long should the mash be? How long should we perform a mash rest? Now, of course, we've discussed this many times with Short and Shoddy, kind of the traditional mash length is 60 minutes. And I very often do not mash for 60 minutes anymore. And I've really looked at the numbers on this. So with my brewing system, I'll typically see a 68% brewing efficiency for kind of a mid-range gravity beer if I mash for an hour. If I just mash for 20 minutes, so 1/3 of the time, I'll get 62% efficiency. So I'm really getting most of the conversion in the first 15 or 20 minutes of that mash, and only just a little bit extra if I go for the full 60 minutes. So as long as it's consistent, which it generally is, I can just kind of plan for that. So if I know I'm getting 62% efficiency and not 68% efficiency, and I still want to get the original gravity that I'm looking for, I can just up the grains in my recipe just a little bit. I mean, you're just tossing in a handful of extra grains, and I can save myself 40 minutes right there.
Yeah, I'm in the same exact boat. That the abbreviating the mash was one of those things. Reducing the mash rest was one of those things right off the bat when we started the experiment series almost 10 years ago that I knew we had to test, and I was wholly convinced that the beer would be cloudier, that that it didn't, that 60 minutes, that's the magical number. You got to go for at least 60 minutes. That's what I was taught. And lo and behold, we've been able to make, and I've had, other people's beers who are mashing for 20, 25, 30 minutes, and they're making fantastic beer. There's really nothing magical about 60 minutes is what I've come to realize. Is that that's just a number that it seems we settled on because it does work. One thing to keep in mind when contemplating, utilizing an abbreviated mash rest is the reality that malt these days is just so well modified. It is primed for to convert, and so that 60 minutes isn't necessarily unnecessary, but you can get away with a 30-minute mash rest and maybe lose, like you said, Martin, 1 or 2 specific gravity points is all. Toss in a handful more base grain and you're set. You're good to go, and that is absolute time saver. Now, I have absolutely talked to people whose issue isn't necessarily that they don't want to rush the brew day. Their thing is they want a relaxing hobby. They want to go out and spend 6 or 7 hours. This episode's not for you. Everybody runs into those times where they wish they could brew, but they don't have 4, 5, 6 hours to set aside. That's what we're talking about here. One of the kind of an alternative approach, instead of reducing the mash rest, and something I've only done a couple of times, is extending the mash rest, right? Rather than going for 30 minutes, still not being married to that 60-minute magical number, and just kind of letting it go until you have time to finish up the brew day. Is that something that you've done before, Martin?
This is one of my favorite things to do. So yeah, if I just want to get to the boil as quickly as possible, I'll do a short mash. But if I just want to work the brew day in around my life and all the other stuff I've got to do during that day, the mash rest is a really good opportunity to drag things out a little bit. So I will start my mash, and then I will go drop my kid off at school or at soccer practice or go shopping or something like that. And if I get back within 60 minutes, then great, I will carry on then. If I don't get back for 2 hours, then so be it. I'm not too worried about extending the mash that way. But actually, one of my real favorites is to go well beyond that even, which is the overnight mash. And I've started doing this really as a matter of course for the higher gravity beers. So if I'm brewing something like a Belgian quad or something like that that's quite a lot stronger, I will find that it does take a bit longer to convert that. So if I just went for a 20-minute mash rest there, I probably would see quite a bit below 62% efficiency. It does seem to need a little longer for conversion.
Yeah.
But you know what? If I run it overnight, then, well, it's got plenty of time to convert. So the way that I'll do that is just before going to bed, I will dough in. So I'll put my grains in, give them a stir, and the system I'm using, it runs a pump, so it's a recirculating system, but I typically won't be running the pump if I'm going overnight. I'll just leave the temperature controller on, set it to whatever my mash temperature is, and let it just cycle the heating element on and off to keep at that mash temperature. So I'll spend, 15 minutes in my brewery at that point, performing the mash, giving it a stir, and then walking out and going to bed. And then next morning, there I have my fully converted mash rest completely finished. I can pull it out and move straight to the boil. So I've split my brew day across 2 days by doing that.
Yeah. It's genius, actually. And I've never done it. I've never done that. I kind of like my approach of just preparing everything the night before and then going out and flipping the switch on my electric, my 240 volt electric kettle and getting it going there. But what I have done is, like you said, I often brew on Monday mornings because I work a 4-10 work schedule at my real job. And so Mondays are my RDO. They're my regular day off. And so often I'll go out and start brewing at like 6 in the morning. And then it's time to take the kids to school and I'll go on that routine. Every once in a while, I might have to stop off somewhere. Well, what I've done is I've started my mash and then I've just left it alone. We are fortunate. I think in the modern age, in the day that we're brewing now, so many people have access to electric brewing systems that allow them to set a temperature and it maintains that fairly well. But I've talked to people who have done overnight mashing as long as 12 hours or whatever in coolers. And that, the mash temperature it'll drop 30, 40 degrees overnight and they come back, they collect all their sweet wort and whether they're sparging or not, they boil it and their beers turn out perfectly fine. You have to remember that, once conversion happens, you're not going to unconvert anything. So that it's already happened there. And so that's not going to be an issue. I think the only worry that I've heard from people who regularly employ an overnight mash, and maybe this is something you can speak to, Martin, is the potential for, some level of souring or contamination because there is, lactobacillus bacteria on grains. We know that. So potentially, but in 12 hours, it's really not going to take hold and do anything anyways, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't think so. And of course, the next stage is the boil. So that's going to help with that. But yeah, I've tried the overnight mash actually in two different ways. One where I left my controller on and the heating element would cycle on and off. And then the second way was I actually just got to mash temperature and turned everything off. And I had insulated my mash tun a little bit, but not very much. And so it started at 152, I think was my mash temp. And it drops down over time. And when I came back to it the next morning, it had dropped maybe 20, 30 degrees. But of course, it had done that quite slowly. So it had still converted. And I looked at my efficiency and I think I was around 70%. So that worked well as well.
Yeah, I just think it's awesome. What a cool thing to be able to use so that when you extend the mash rest, what you're really doing is breaking up your brew day so that it feels, each little chunk is less time consuming, even though it ultimately is taking the same amount of time, to do things. By breaking it up, you're not compiling all of that into one day. And I think that's really neat. One other thing, I don't believe we've done an episode on the experiment, our overnight mash experiment that Brian Hall did many years ago, but I won't get into the details, but we'll just say people could not tell those beers apart. So it is a valid approach that can create fantastic beer. If that's something you've been considering, there you go. Let's talk a little bit about the boil. There's not much, I don't think, that you can do besides not boiling as long, which we're going to focus on, of course. But there are some things that I've found do help out with the boil, and I'm going to get a little bit detailed here. One of my favorite products is Firm Cap S, which I believe is just simethicone, like anti-gas liquid, so that you give it to babies and stuff so that their tummies don't hurt. What it does is it reduces the surface tension, I believe, of the wort so that it doesn't boil over. You don't get these nasty, dirty boil overs. Does it save any time? Not up front, but it will save you time in the end if you don't have to clean up a sticky, worty mess at the end of your brew day. So I use that every batch of beer that I make because I hate boil overs. What about you, Martin? Are you a Firm Cap S guy or what?
I have very rarely used Firm Cap S. I've not had a boil over problem too much. With the controller, I know what percentage of power to give it to get it to a rolling boil without going crazy.
Yeah.
So that seems to work quite well. I mean, I think another thing time-saving wise is to make sure that the moment that you've pulled the grains out, so mash is done, is to make sure that you are then immediately moving to the boil stage. So for me, I'll pull my grains out and I'll kind of let them drain out of the basket that's in the system. But as soon as the grains are pulled out, I'm already starting to heat that water up so that I can reach the boil as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I do the same thing. While I use a bag still, not a basket, but I dangle it. I have it on a pulley and I'll dangle it over the kettle. And while it's dripping, I've got my 240 volt, system on full blast just to get it up to a boil as soon as possible. Note, do not walk away from if you have 100% on a 240 volt system with a 5-gallon batch of beer, it will boil over in no time flat. So be careful. I learned from experience on that one. Another thing, you've been there, Martin.
That is not the time to go shopping.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing that I like to do is use kettle findings. So we're talking Irish moss, or I've used Whirlfloc, stuff like that. Only because in the end, it helps to decrease the time it takes for your beer to clear. And I happen to like clear beer. So for me, again, thinking ahead, it's not going to save time during the boil by any means, but it will, expedite the serving time if you're waiting for that beer to clear. And again, we've done an experiment where I compared a beer made with Irish moss and one without it, and the Irish moss batch actually ended up clearing up faster than the one made without it, which surprised me. I didn't think it would work that well. So that's something I do as well. Other than that, I think the main place you're going to save time during the boil is by reducing your boil length.
Yeah, absolutely. So just as the magic number for the mash was 60 minutes, then the boil magic number is either 60 minutes or 90 minutes, depending on who you ask. I very frequently cannot stand there for an hour watching this stuff boil and knowing that it could be done in less time.
Yeah.
But of course, there are some considerations if you have a shorter boil. And the first one really relates to hops and bitterness, that if you are adding your bittering hops in a 30-minute boil, let's say, instead of a 60-minute boil, well, that's 30 minutes less of isomerization, and you will need to add a few more hops in for the bitterness addition than you would otherwise do. Super easy with brewing software to figure that out, but that is something to consider. It also has the advantage that if you are boiling for less time, you will be starting with less water because there's going to be less time for boil off, which actually helps speed up the entire process because that's less water that needs to be heated and cooled. So that's kind of handy as well. But of course, the big downside you hear of only boiling for 30 minutes or so is, well, DMS. So Marshall, tell me, I should be terribly worried about DMS, right?
Well, I mean, according to, appealing to authority, absolutely. Dimethyl sulfide, it is a corny, canned vegetable nastiness. To me, when I've done flavor standards, it smells more like warm ketchup. But that's a big concern. It's one of the reasons that it's recommended that you boil for an absolute minimum of 60 minutes. Except for we've done multiple experiments on, reduced boil length versus 60 minutes, 90 minutes, 120 minutes. And it just doesn't seem to have much of an impact. That reduced boil very rarely produces a beer. I mean, we haven't been able to produce a beer that has notable levels of DMS. And in fact, we sent a Pilsner that was made, I think it was 100% Pilsner malt. Maybe it was 95%, something like that. But Pilsner malt is the high DMS. You got to boil for 90 minutes if you're using that. We sent it to a lab, and it measured as undetectable DMS and no different than the beer that was boiled for 90 minutes. So it's I think it was 30-minute versus 90-minute boil. So there, if you're concerned about DMS, I'm not sure that's where your focus should be. If you need to save time on a brew day, abbreviate your boil. It works. That's been my experience, and we have done one thing we do in every short and shoddy batch that we brew is reduce the boil to at least 30 minutes or less. So we've done the 20-minute boils. That works well. It's pretty crazy how well it works. Like you said, you're going to have to use more hops to get the bitterness you want, and that may kind of inform the style of beer that you're going to brew if you're using this method. Though I've made double IPA with a 30-minute boil, and they come out great. So pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, totally. And if you combine everything we said with the mash and the boil, it means you can really get down to a very short brew day. I tried as an experiment to see if I could brew a beer in 1 hour. So that's from mashing in through to the beer being in the fermenter. And to do that, I had a 20-minute mash and I had a 20-minute boil, and then the rest of the 20 minutes was really just reaching those temperatures and then transferring into the fermenter and chilling. Totally doable. So the excuse that, I don't really have time for a brew day today, if you have a free hour, you totally have time for a brew day.
That's crazy to think. I mean, people who've been brewing for as long as we have, the fact that you can knock out a batch. I mean, our short and shoddy brew days, I think the average is about 2 hours. I've brewed a batch of beer from start to finish, pitching the yeast and putting it in the firm chamber in 1 hour and 35 minutes. I mean, that's gnarly. So it is an option. And those beers, you don't have to take my word for it. Try it out for yourself. They come out really well. So the last thing I want to focus on in this segment before we move on is chilling. And there are some little tricks that you can do. A lot of people I know who are using, say, immersion chillers will just plop the immersion chiller in their wort. And then as soon as the boil is over and they've got that chiller nice and sanitized, they turn the water on. They let it, it's a low flow. They don't want to, waste water. It's a low flow of water, and they just let it sit in the wort until that wort chills, and it'll take 20-30 minutes for it to do that. There is a much more efficient approach to chilling with an immersion chiller. All you have to do, and I know a lot of people will shake their heads. Again, we don't want to waste the water, but if you turn your water on all the way from your spigot, high flow of water, and then you constantly agitate that wort, we're talking that wort's going to get down to 5 or 6 degrees above groundwater temperatures in about 5 to 6 minutes, depending on the type of immersion chiller that you have. So that has been something I've done ever since I was first introduced to the idea by the Jaded Brewing guys, and it works phenomenally well. So I'm still an immersion chiller user, and like I said, as soon as the boil is over, if I'm not doing a hop stand or whatever, I turn my water on full blast. I collect the water for cleaning. I will collect the first 5 gallons in a bucket, and it's nice hot water, right? It's coming out of that chiller that's in your boiling wort. I'll collect that, and then when I'm done with the chiller, I just dip it in the bucket of hot water. So I'm not really wasting it, but it works phenomenally well. So that's one way that I save time with chilling. Is it reduces that chill time from 30 minutes down to about 6-7 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. I use a counterflow chiller rather than an immersion chiller. And I found the same sort of thing. So you want to get a higher flow of water through that counterflow chiller as possible. And then with the counterflow chiller, you can restrict how much work comes out the other end. So I will sort of crank it down to about half so that it takes a little bit longer for all of that work to pass through the counterflow chiller and meet the cold water that's coming the other way. And I did a few experiments on this as to what is the most effective way of chilling the wort using a counterflow chiller. So the way I used to do it was I would recirculate that chilled wort back into my kettle and keep pumping this around and around, and then ultimately the temperature of the wort in the kettle would slowly drop. So maybe the temperature of the wort that came out of the counterflow chiller might be around 80 Fahrenheit, and it would go into the kettle. It was 120 Fahrenheit, so it would kind of chill it down that way.
Yeah.
And then once I got to where I was just a few degrees above groundwater, then I would move that into my fermenter. But I actually found a more effective way to do it is to just recirculate just initially until you get down to around 180 Fahrenheit. So at that point, we're below the rate of any isomerization, so it's going to stop that with any of the hops that are in there. And from then, just go straight into the fermenter with a very slow flow rate. And that way I can get my entire chilling process done in 7 or 8 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, I've used counterflow chillers as well, both types, the tube and the plate type. And at same exact experience that you're explaining, Martin, is I would recirculate until that wort is down to like 180, 160, and then run it into the fermenter nice and slow so that you're really getting that wort chilled as it's going into the fermenter. There's this whole thing about ice baths. You'll see it online. You can Google it if you want to. I've done it a few times. To me, it's just a pain in the ass. You first off, you got to go buy a bag of ice. So there's that. And then you're putting a pre-chiller, which is just basically an immersion chiller in there, or a pump to pump the cold water through the your immersion chiller or whatever chiller you're using. It's just a pain, and it's sort of effective, but it's just not worth the payoff in my experience. Have you ever tried an ice bath, Martin?
So I tried, when I did have an immersion chiller, I put my immersion chiller in a bucket of water, and then I put that in my chest freezer. So I froze the immersion chiller inside the bucket of water. And I figured that way that when the wort was, I use that to then chill my water down, and then the wort would be way chilled faster. It totally didn't work. It was an absolute waste of time. And I mean, the energy it must have taken my chest freezer just to freeze that water in place, and then, not worth it. Yeah. Totally not worth it.
I agree with you. There are, before we talk about no chill, the no chill method, that is very common in certain parts of the world. Hi, our Australian listeners. There's kind of a hybrid chilling thing. I call it hybrid chilling, where you chill the wort to as low as it'll go in, 6 to 7 minutes, whatever that is, and then transfer it to your fermenter. It's usually going to be still too warm to pitch the yeast, but then you just throw that in your fermentation chamber and let it chill down to your pitching temperature. I've done that hundreds of times. It works great. It's particularly where I live in the summer, our groundwater temperature will be 83 degrees. So I can only chill my wort down to 85 at best. And so I'm usually doing a post chilling before I pitch my yeast. But obviously we can't talk about chilling without talking about the no-chill method. This is a very, very simple approach wherein you take your boiling wort and you rack it into a clean, heat-safe vessel. They're referred to as cubes often. And I believe they're made of HDPE, but you got to make sure it's food safe. I've got one at my place because I've done this a couple of times. And then you take that hot wort and you just store it in a relatively cool place for 12, 18, 24 hours until it chills down, and then you pour that into your fermentation chamber the next day, or into your fermenter the next day, and you can again chill it down to your actual pitching temp from there. But it's an effective means of avoiding the whole chilling process altogether. You're just letting it kind of naturally chill down as soon as the boil is over, so it can save a little bit of time, definitely some elbow grease. In my experience, I've not been terribly pleased with the quality of the beers that I've made using the no-chill method. I tend to get kind of this grassy flavor when I've done it, but I've had beers made by others using this method that I would never have guessed was no-chill. So your mileage may vary on that one. I don't use the no-chill method because I'm able to quickly chill my wort anyways. What about you, Martin?
I actually tried doing the no-chill, but I didn't have a cube. I just put the basically boiling wort straight into a corny keg.
Yeah.
And then left that out for a little while, and then I ended up putting it in my fridge. I ended up learning a few interesting things from that. One is that the corny keg, being stainless steel, gets extremely hot.
Yeah.
And it stays extremely hot. So I made the mistake of just kind of putting my hands on it to touch it a few hours later. I'm regretting that. And it continued to radiate heat for so long. So I didn't even want to put it into my chest freezer until it cooled down a bit, so I didn't kind of blow out the compressor on the freezer.
Yeah.
And it took a long time to really cool down. So I didn't find it a very effective way of dispersing heat, which was, I think, the biggest problem.
Yeah. The other thing to keep in mind, if my understanding about how the no-chill method really came to be a thing, it was because in Australia, where it was, it was basically developed, they have drought issues, and so they need to conserve water. Well, the beauty of no-chill is you're not using any water to chill the wort, so you're just racking it to. I think actually a corny keg is probably the safest vessel safest in terms of not extracting, weird flavors or plastics or whatever. Not so safe in terms of the heat, because that metal will get very, very hot. You got to be careful with that. But yeah, you're not using any water except for what you're brewing with, which is pretty sweet. So if you're in a place where you need to conserve water and an immersion or, a counterflow chiller isn't an option, then no chill may be right up your alley. So, well, that gets us through most of the actual brewing related stuff, but we are not done yet. When we come back, we're going to be talking about our experiences saving time on the cold side of brewing. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the exGEERience, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle, as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to exGEERience.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. Getting wort produced and chilled are certainly some of the more important aspects of making beer, but there's more to it than just that. Obviously, you cannot have beer without the wonder of fermentation. Martin, what are some of the time-saving tips that you use to save time when it comes to fermenting beer?
Yeah, so first thing is I like to just use a direct yeast pitch. So I will take usually liquid yeast in my case, and then just add it straight in. So by doing that, I have skipped the step of the yeast starter, which is not something that's going to extend your brew day as such, because it's something you do ahead of time. But it's still more time spent brewing, and it also means a bit of planning. Like I have to have done that a few days before I was ready to brew, and I had to know I was going to be brewing. So I like to just pull out a packet of yeast from my fridge and pitch that in directly. The other thing that I have done is a vitality starter, which is kind of like a yeast starter, but a last minute one. And the process for that is you steal a little bit of the chilled wort and at the end of the brew day, and you pitch your yeast into that, and then you can put it on a stir plate just as you would with a yeast starter, and leave that for an hour or so, and then pitch that into the wort. And the idea there is you're not going to have done much to increase the number of yeast cells, but they will have got started and awakened before you're putting them into the beer. So if I'm going to do any kind of preparation for the yeast, it will be that, but generally I'm skipping yeast starters these days.
Yeah, you realize how blasphemous you sound right now, Martin. That is this whole idea of yeast pitch rate was it was utterly drilled into my head when I started taking brewing seriously, that the two primary things that you have to do if you want to make quality beer are control your fermentation temperatures and make yeast starters. The idea behind that is, as you mentioned, is to increase the viability or the cell count of those of the yeast, so that you're pitching an adequate amount of yeast to go do the work that we want them to do. You have to imagine back in the day, I mean, we're talking 20, 30 years ago even, the yeast that was available to homebrewers in particular simply wasn't that viable. You didn't have that many homebrewers, first off. So the yeast that they were getting might be a 50% viability because it's 2 months old or whatever it is. These days, we have access to phenomenally fresh yeast that is high quality. I mean, we use imperial yeast at Brülosophy. We advocate for imperial yeast. We love them, but there are other labs that are doing basically the same thing. You've got Omega. White Labs even has updated their packaging, and I believe they're including more yeast cells in their pitch pouches, in their direct pitch pouches. You're not going to talk to a lab who says don't make a starter, because they want to ensure that you have a good product in the end, and knowing that you're using their product to produce said beer at the end, they don't want that to be the reason for you failing, right? I get that. I'm telling you, I haven't made a starter in probably 4 years at this point, and I have yet to have any of the issues that you might associate with a low pitch rate. We've done multiple pitch rate experiments. Absolutely, there is a point to where if it's too low of a pitch rate, you're going to taste it. I've done it multiple times on my own just to test things out, not even in experiments, and it's pretty bad. You get autolysis, that burnt rubber smell, or a very sulfury smell. That's not good stuff. But for the most part, even if you're making high OG beers, the whole viability starter thing, in my opinion, is really just kind of insurance at this point. You've got access to fresh yeast. You want to make a starter, go ahead and do it. But if you skip it, you're probably going to be okay so long as the yeast you're using is fresh and from a legit lab. And like you, Martin, vitality starters, I mean, they work incredibly well. This was an idea that was posed to me by Colin Kaminsky, who co-authored the Water Book with John Palmer. He reached out many years ago and shared this this research article. I believe it was Coors England who did it on what we now term vitality starters, and they work incredibly well. You can take a low pitch rate old yeast, prop it up in you're not even really propagating it, but make a vitality starter of it. Takes an hour, before you pitch it, and it'll get to work right away in a beer. And I just think it's so awesome that we have, these are resources we can use nowadays.
Yeah, I love that. And it's really not adding an awful lot of time, as you say. It's just spin it for an hour or two, probably cleaning up my brewery and whatnot then anyway. And then pitch it into the wort. So that's been really good. I think then the other thing we really need to look at with fermentation is to actually talk about the duration of the fermentation itself. And is there anything we can do to speed that up? And some of the things we've looked at, something I guess Brülosophy is quite famous for is warm fermenting lagers. So,
oh boy,
yeah. I mean, we won't go into that too much as we've covered that many times. But the fact is, if you do raise up the fermentation temperature on lager yeast, it is likely to complete quicker. So that's going to save a bit of time. But even if you don't want to do that, just considering fermentation temperature and raising the temperature near the end of fermentation can be very helpful. So bumping it up or 5-10 Fahrenheit or 4 or 5 Celsius, that can help make sure that the yeast do finish and that they clean up properly after themselves. So that's a good thing to add in.
Yeah, that's another one that I mean, this is we didn't invent this one by any means. This has been recommended for many years. In fact, when making lagers, cool fermented lagers, ramping the temperature towards the end of fermentation is referred to as a diacetyl rest. So it serves many purposes. But one of the things that we know is that yeast, like many organisms, is more active in warmer temperatures. Obviously, there's a Goldilocks zone. You don't want to get too hot or you're going to kill it off. But by ramping the temperature of your fermenting beer by 5 to 7 degrees, 2 to 3 days into fermentation, you're out of that growth phase, which is where those off flavors develop, and you're going to encourage that yeast to kind of do their thing quicker. You're going to get down to your target final gravity sooner, and it's going to work to reuptake any of the undesirable fermentation byproducts. I do this every batch, unless I forget, but for the most part, I ramp the temperature after 2 to 3 days of fermentation of every single batch I make, whether it's a lager, an ale, whether it's high OG, low OG, and it works phenomenally well. I've never had any off flavors associated with like a warm fermentation by ramping the temperature a couple of days into fermentation. So now, as everyone knows, this is no secret. I talk about it often. I am a big fan of clear beer. So when you're done fermenting, obviously, it's time to start considering, what are we going to do? Before we package this beer, is there anything I can do to ensure that it looks the way that I want it to look when I'm serving it? One method that a lot of people rely on is cold crashing, or dropping the fermented beer, the temperature of the fermented beer to, freezing, basically 32 to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, or like 0 to 1 degree Celsius. And you let it sit for 12 to 24 hours, even longer if you want to. And what that does is it encourages the crap that's in the wort, there's a lot of it, whether that's polyphenols, the haze causing proteins, all that kind of stuff, to drop out of the solution so that you can rack clear wort to your keg or to bottles. And this is something, again, I do it as a matter of course. The one thing you got to be careful about, obviously, is that you're not sucking in oxygen. I am still very concerned about cold side oxidation. I was just reading something recently on the internet who somebody was saying that, cold side oxidation is a myth, blah, blah, blah. Well, not in our experiments. It hasn't been. I used to think that too, though, so I can relate. But so with cold crashing, I always do it under pressure. And again, I let it sit for usually 24 to 36 hours. And then I rack the beer off the top of that trube that's left at the bottom of the fermenter so that I've got clear beer in my keg.
Yes, that's right. And then, of course, the other thing you can do is add fining agents as well. So we should probably talk a little bit about the different types of fining agents that are available. What are some of your favorites?
Well, my absolute favorite, and the one that I still use solely these days, is gelatin. It's cheap and it's phenomenally effective. All you do is mix half a teaspoon of powdered gelatin, or I believe you can get like the gelatin sheets. You'd have to figure out what a half a teaspoon of powdered converts to, but you blend that into a third of a cup of boiling water until the gelatin is fully dissolved, and then you add that to your cold beer. You want the beer to be cold because that gelatin is going to get to work a lot quicker in a cold beer, and that's the idea. And what it will do is it attracts, I believe it's negatively charged, and it attracts positively charged ions, so that it all that stuff gets heavier as it clumps together and it drops out of solution. It's amazing how well gelatin works. That being said, I've used Biofine Clear. I've found that I believe you add to the fermented beer sort of like gelatin, but there's some evidence that suggests that Biofine works best if the beer is agitated while it's in contact. I heard this from a professional brewer who recirculates their beer after adding Biofine because of that reason. Again, I've not found it to be as effective as gelatin, and even less effective in my experience is Clarity Firm, which you add during fermentation. Some people use Clarity Firm because it purportedly reduces the gluten content in their beer. So that's a really cool, kind of byproduct of using Clarity Firm, but I've not noticed it having any impact on the ultimate appearance of my beer. So, have you used any of these findings, to clear up your beers?
Yeah, so I've used gelatin. You mentioned the guideline of 0.5 teaspoons in a third of a cup. I don't know what you're talking about. It's 3 grams in 60 milliliters of water for people using actually scientific measurements. So that's the mix I'll use. I tend to add my gelatin into the fermenter and let all of the trube kind of fall out into the fermenter and then transfer to the keg from there, which seems to work quite a bit better.
Yeah, that's okay. So I do the same thing. That's my preference. I have absolutely fined in the keg, and it works well. You just have a thicker sludge at the bottom that you got to pour off before you start drinking. But we've had past contributors who prefer finding in the serving vessel in the keg, and that works perfectly fine as well. So however you want to do it, I'm like you. I want to rack the clearest beer possible to my keg so that I can then carbonate it quicker and start drinking it within 24 hours. That's what I love. So, but before we move on to packaging and carbonating and all that stuff, let's talk a little bit about one more way of clearing up your beer, which is mechanical filtration. Have you ever used an actual beer filter for your beer?
No, I've heard a few of the other Brülosophy contributors talking about this, and it sounds like a royal pain. I have not, but do you have any experience with this yourself?
So I've never used one in my brewery, but I've hung out with people. I've had people ask me like, "Oh, you're not a brewer. You didn't make it yourself." Hey, look, man, I stirred the wort at my friend's house. So I brewed that beer with them. Technically, brewing's not all that difficult. But I've hung out with people who have used these things, and I would never do it because one, they're messy. Two, I'm terrified of oxidation, and to me, you just can't control it well enough. But boy, I'll tell you, the beers come out bright. We're talking like commercial clarity bright. Last time I was with a friend who was using one of these plate filters that they bought off of More Beer, I believe, actually. They had to go through 2 pads, 2 filtration pads because of how hazy the beer that they were filtering was. Again, just not worth the effort in my opinion. But if you're after that clear look, boy, it really does work.
Yeah, I don't think it's really going to be a worthwhile time saving. If we're talking about time saving, that just throwing in a little bit of gelatin or other fining when the beer is cold seems to do a really good job.
Absolutely. Let's move on to packaging. I'm not sure there's many things that one can do to, expedite the packaging process. This is actually one area that I'm okay taking my time on because of my fear of cold side oxidation. I purge all of my kegs by pushing liquid out with CO2. I understand that if you are somebody who bottle conditions your beer, which is rad, keep doing that. By the way, to go back to fining, you can fine your beer that you plan to bottle condition. There will still be more than enough yeast in suspension to carbonate it once you put it in the bottles. My brother doesn't have a kegging setup and bottle conditions his beer, and he always fines with gelatin, cold crashes, fines with gelatin, and then goes to the bottling bucket, bottles up his beers, and they come out beautiful, crystal clear, and just the slightest little layer of trub at the bottom of each bottle. None of that thick, sludgy stuff. So that works really well. But when it comes to packaging, man, this is one area I'm just going to say, take your time. Do it right.
I think the one thing that you could look at for time saving here is not to have to transfer at all. So this is where you could consider fermenting in kegs and serving in the same vessel as that you fermented in. This is something I've done a few times where I will use a floating dip tube. So I'll take out the regular metal dip tube and replace it with a floating dip tube, and I'll ferment in the keg, and then I will chill it down and serve directly from that keg. And we're going to pull the beer from the top because we're using that floating dip tube.
Right.
So we'll stay away from all the fermentation product on the bottom. And I've just skipped an entire step there of actually performing any kind of transfer. So that can be a handy one.
So I've never done that. And it's surprising for some people to hear that, I'm sure, because I'm the short and shoddy guy, right? But I've never fermented in the serving vessel that I can recall, at least. When you do that, I'm just curious, when you get done with that beer, you're using a floating dip tube. So I think the biggest concern people will have up front is, well, gosh, how much trub are you going to pull out of that keg when you first start serving it? Well, these floating dip tubes, as it sounds, they float at the top of the beer. So you're getting the clearest beer first, which is great. My question is, when you get done with that beer, how thick is the trub layer at the bottom of that keg? I have to imagine there's a ton in there.
Yeah, it's pretty thick. And the other thing is that this is something to do if it's a beer you're going to consume relatively quickly, but not so much if you're planning on sticking around. In fact, I have a lager that I fermented in a keg that I was serving to somebody this week, and I'm nearly at the bottom of that now, but it's 6 months old, and we just got this overwhelming sulfur smell from the beer as we're really getting down to the dregs, because it has been sat on that trub layer for so long now, and it's so close to that the floating dip tube is pulling from that it wasn't great. So I think if you are planning on consuming the beer within a couple of weeks, it's going to be fine to leave it on all of that trub, but otherwise you might want to consider transferring it off.
Yeah, I've done the thing where I've left beers in the fermentation vessel for 3-4 months, just as again, I'm a weirdo, man. Before I even started the experiment series, I was testing these things out for myself because I wanted to get a grasp of what could happen if you do these, no-nos, basically the things that you're recommended not to do. And I think it was a stout one time that I left on the lees or the trub for like 3 months in the fermentation vessel, and that stout came out perfectly fine. I didn't taste any. I'm very sensitive to autolyzed off flavors. They're awful to me. It tastes like burnt rubber. I didn't get anything like that in this stout. And so I wouldn't be too concerned, especially since you're storing those kegs cold. If you're going to ferment in the keg that you're serving out of, I don't think it's going to be much of an issue, particularly if you're drinking that beer in 2 to 3 months. You're probably going to be perfectly fine. So, but again, I can't speak to that because I've never actually done it. Now, once you get that beer nice and, once you get it into the keg, you want to get it nice and carbonated. And I remember when I first moved into kegging, you look at these carbonation charts. It's like, oh, my keezer is this temperature, and I want it to be, this many volumes of CO2. So I've got I've got my CO2 right now set at 14 psi, so I've got to leave it in there for 2 weeks. I'm like, why don't I just bottle condition? It takes the same amount of time, I started looking for quicker ways to carbonate beer, and the first thing I settled on was this shake method. I know you know what I'm talking about, Martin, where you put like 30 psi of pressure on your keg, that's your filled keg, and then you shake the thing for like 8 to 10 minutes to dissolve that CO2 into the beer, and then you can throw it in your fridge and let it sit for 10, 15 minutes and start drinking it, and it's carbonated. It works. Yeah, I've done it multiple times. It's very, very unpredictable. I've overcarbonated many beers using this method. How about you, Martin?
Yeah, and it's also really tiring because you can see you got 5-gallon keg and you're shaking that thing. 8 to 10 minutes is a long time. A trick that Kyle from Clawhammer told me that he does if he's in a rush for carbonation is he will put the keg on the floor under his desk, and then he will roll it back and forth with his feet while he's like working on his computer, and he'll just do that for like 20 or 30 minutes while it's at 30 psi, and that's another way of doing it. But yeah, as you say, it's very difficult to know how much CO2 is actually going to get into solution in the beer when you perform that sort of method. So you can end up with a beer that's still flat after all that effort, or one that is completely overcarbonated. Yeah.
I don't use this method anymore at all. The last time I did it was with a cider, actually, and people were coming over the day that I kegged it. So I went ahead and did that. I like my cider overcarbonated, so I wasn't too worried about getting it too fizzy. Plus, it doesn't foam up the way beer does, so it worked out really well for that. But make sure the beer's cold. If you're going to use that method, you got to make sure the beer's cold, because CO2 does not readily dissolve into warm liquids the way that it does with cold liquids. But my preferred method for carbonating is something we refer to as burst carbonation, which is incredibly simple and very effective. All you do is you have to have a higher pressure CO2 regulator. I've got a primary regulator on my tank that goes into a secondary regulator, so I can control the PSI, the pressure going to each keg independently, which I love. It's a little expensive, but it's worth it in my opinion. And so what I'll do is I'll set it to 50 PSI, hit the keg with it, and then walk away and leave it alone for 12 to 18 hours before coming back. And then I get emails from people who are like, when I did it, I reduced my pressure back down to serving pressure, which I do 12 to 14 PSI. And these people are like, but the first pour off of the keg just was all foam and came out super fast. You have to relieve the pressure on your keg before you start serving it. You've still got 50 PSI of pressure in there, even though your gauge is reading, 14 PSI. So pull your PRV, release all the pressure out of it, and then set your regulator back down to serving pressure after 18 hours or so, and you're going to have a very well carbonated beer that, to me, is very similar to what you'd get from waiting 2 weeks at serving pressure. It works incredibly well. It's why I use it every time I carbonate a drink.
Yeah, and that's my preferred method as well. The one other thing you can do just to completely eliminate the carbonation step at this point is to carbonate the beer when it's in the fermenter. So I have a carbonation stone, which I can use. So once the beer is in the fermenter and I'm performing the cold crash, now we've got cold beer, it's sitting there cold. Why not ferment it now as well? Why not carbonate it now as well? So I will hook up my carbonation stone to some CO2, set the pressure to whatever the maximum pressure my fermenter will support, which is sort of 12, 13 PSI, and just leave it there for a couple of days while it's cold crashing. And then that way, when I am racking the beer, I'm racking carbonated beer.
Disclaimer, you cannot do this in carboys or non-pressure rated fermentation vessels. Don't try to do this in a SS Brewtech brew bucket. Those are rated for 1 PSI. Ask me how I know that it doesn't work, because I've tried. But you can absolutely. I really love the Delta Brewing Systems firm tanks. Their fermentation vessels. They're 8 gallons, so they're more than big enough for a 5-gallon batch. And I believe with the proper fittings, you can get up to 15 PSI in those things. So you could, like you're talking about, I know you use the Spike Brewing conicals. I believe the Blickman conicals do it. The SS conicals are pressure rated. There are a lot of fermentation vessels out there that have the capacity, the ability to hold, pressure. And if you can do that, it works wonderfully. And the beauty of that is you're combining your carbonation time with your cold crashing and your gelatin fining and all of that stuff. And because of the placement of the valves on these fermentation vessels, you then just rack carbonated beer into your serving vessel, or you could even serve it out of the keg. I have a buddy who was doing that for a while, actually, carbonating his beer in his keg, and then we just go pull samples right off of the keg, and it was perfectly fine carbonated beer. So lots of cool options there. In that, really, when you think about it, Martin, that's just same thing as like fermenting in a keg and then serving out of that keg, but.
Yeah, exactly like that. So as you say, you're combining multiple steps together there, and you've just cut out either 18 hours of time there, or 8 to 10 minutes of very unpleasant shaking.
Yeah, the shake method, not my thing anymore. I still, like I said, in a pinch, I'll do it. But all right, let's talk a little bit about the worst part of brewing, which is cleaning. I absolutely hate this, but if brewers are anything, we're glorified custodians. You know, we clean things nonstop, and if you don't, you're probably not going to appreciate the outcome of your beer as much because you need clean gear to make clean beer. I should trademark that, the rhyme on that one. But one of my tricks for cleaning, and I do this when I'm cooking, I do this when I'm playing with the kids, is cleaning as I go. I don't leave anything out. If I have a minute to clean something, I'm going to clean it so that it's done and out of the way as I'm moving on to other things in the process. For example, when I was doing batch sparging, I would collect the sweet wort, put it in the boil kettle, light my flame under my kettle, and then while that was heating up, I would go and thoroughly clean my MLT, my cooler MLT. When I'm done, now I do this brew in a bag in a electric system. And as soon as I'm done mashing and I remove those grains, I toss the grains and I clean my brew bag. I don't want it to get sticky or stained or anything like that. And so I'm doing that while brewing as well, so that it's all combined and it saves a lot of time. I feel like that's one of the more important aspects to keeping my brew day organized, because I'm neurotic like that, but making sure that I'm picking things up, putting them away, and cleaning them as I'm brewing throughout that time.
Yeah, and the other advantage of cleaning as you go, as opposed to leaving it all to the end, is that it's much easier to clean stuff when it hasn't been sitting out for a long time. So yeah. I will do the same. I'll pull out my grain basket and I will clean that thing straight away. In the past, when I haven't done that and I just kind of leave it all in a big pile for when I feel like it later, everything's gooey and sticky and it takes so much more effort to clean it. So cleaning as you go is a great way to do it. I also like to soak stuff overnight because it saves a lot of scrubbing as well. So I might just fill up my brew kettle when it's done. Give it a very cursory rinse and just fill it up with some kind of cleaning product and let it sit there overnight, and it will do the scrubbing for me, and I can just rinse it out afterwards, which probably moves us on nicely to talking about our preferred cleaning products. Marshall, do you have a preference for what you use for that?
So again, I've got a thing for efficiency, and I've used PBW, I've used Craftmaster's powdered brewery wash, I've used OxyClean Free quite a bit. My word, there is a brewery wash from exChillerator. They make the very popular exChillerator Max counterflow chillers. I know you use one of those, Martin. Quite a few of the contributors are using the exChillerator Max counterflow chillers these days. They also make a brewery wash. Now, they had it specially designed for them because they know that people worry a little bit about making sure that their chillers are clean when you can't see on the inside of it. So they had this proprietary, a blend of a powdered brewery wash that is phenomenally powerful. I don't know what is in this stuff. It's safe. It's very pungent. When you mix it up with some water, you're going to get an aroma off of it, but it's safe. You can touch it. And I use it for so much more than just brewing stuff in my house. This stuff works incredibly well. Better than OxyClean Free in my experience, better than PBW. What's your, so that's my favorite, without a doubt. I always keep it on hand. What's your favorite, Martin?
Yeah, that's exactly what I use as well. I saw that there is a liquid PBW version, which I was quite interested in. So that is in my Amazon shopping cart. I might give that a try at some point. The nice thing about using a liquid is that you don't have to worry about the powder dissolving. I have found sometimes if I don't stir the powder and I've added it in, it doesn't necessarily work as well. And the liquid PBW is supposed to work just at room temperature as well. It doesn't need hot water. But the downside is I think it's going to be quite expensive, but maybe I'll give that a try. But yeah, generally I use the exChillerator brewery wash as well.
Yeah.
Soak stuff with that, give it a rinse the next day, and call it done.
Yeah. Now I'm with you. I like the being able to just let the stuff sit. That you make up a wash solution, a cleansing solution, and then you let it sit. Particularly when it comes to kegs. But there are some other tricks. If you've got that scum in a keg that you just can't get out by letting it sit, I've had people email me and they're like, how do you get that stuff out of the bottom of the keg? My arms aren't long enough to reach down there. go and get yourself a toilet wand cleaner, just a, or even like a dish brush, and that will extend your arm by about a foot, and you can scrub the bottom of your keg. Don't use it after you've cleaned your toilet with it, of course. But yeah, that's what I do. Is I that's a little tip I got from a friend of mine. Is you get those toilet wands that have the brush is kind of round, so it surrounds the whole end, the whole tip of the wand, and you just kind of rub it around at the bottom. You can get those kegs sparkling clean. One little tip for when it comes to cleaning kegs that I like to do: I don't take apart my kegs between every batch. I'll do that between every 5th or 6th batch. But to ensure that the poppets and the disconnects are clean, what I will do is fill the keg with brewery wash, very, very hot, and then hit it with a little bit of CO2 and depress or press down on the liquid out poppet so that brewery wash flows out of the disconnect there. And now I'll let it sit in there overnight as well, so that I know, or I'm more confident at least that the dip tube is just as clean as the rest of the keg.
Yeah, that's a really good one, and I have a similar sort of process. So I will fill up my kettle with the brewery wash, and then I'll get it to 120, 130. Sort of reheat the water so it's warm. Let it sit overnight. Then I will transfer that water into kegs and do exactly what you're saying, letting it sit. But before I do that transfer, I'll heat that water back up again to about 120 or 130. So it's hot water again going into the kegs, leave it in the kegs for about a day, and then pump it back out through the dip tube from the keg. And that way, everything has been cleaned, and I only needed one load of brewery wash to do all of that.
Yeah, yep, I'm the same way. And here's the cool thing about brewery wash. You can reuse it. Just because you cleaned one thing with it doesn't mean you can't clean something else with it. I've been known to do I'll let one keg sit overnight, and then I'll transfer that brewery wash into another keg, let that one sit overnight while I clean the other one. The stuff is just powerful. And if you're using, at least in my experience, whether it's PBW Accelerator, OxyClean Free, make sure it's OxyClean Free if you're going to go the OxyClean route. You don't want the smelly stuff to clean your fermentation vessels with. You want the free, so it doesn't have any of that extra junk in there. But yeah, you can reuse the cleaners, and it works really well. Powerful stuff. So before we end this episode, I do think that, if we're talking about not necessarily short and shoddy brewing, but just brewing with time constraints, doing things to ensure that we are utilizing our time as efficiently as possible while making beer, are there certain styles that you think work best with doing this? Or are you of the opinion, as I am, Martin, that you can utilize these methods that we've discussed for pretty much any style out there, so long as you take certain things into consideration?
Yeah, you absolutely can. So I will pick different things from what we've discussed depending on what the beer is I'm making. So I mentioned with high gravity beers, I will typically do an overnight mash with that because I don't want to wait 60, 90 minutes for that to convert. I'll just let it do it while I sleep. The other sort of style that I've done and turned around quickly are some IPAs where I wanted a beer within a week. So for that one, I used some Voskevike yeast, which of course ferments super, super fast. And I was able to turn around an IPA in 5 days, which was just in time for the party that I was preparing it for, having left it all to the last minute. And my goodness, the Kvike yeast just ferments so very quickly. I fermented this batch at 95 Fahrenheit or 35 Celsius. Like the airlock was strongly bubbling after 2 hours. Like I'd barely finished cleaning stuff up and it was already bubbling away. And it was mostly done within 48 hours. So that gave me plenty of time then to perform a cold crash, fining, carbonation, everything. And I had that beer ready in 5 days. So yeah, you can turn around beers very quickly using some of these methods.
Yeah, and we're going to have listeners, I guarantee we're going to get emails from people saying, I can't believe you did an episode on brewing with time constraints and you didn't talk about this or that. Kvike is one of those things, so we might as well just drop it now. If you really need to turn a beer around quickly, go get some Kvike yeast. You've got Lutro, which I believe is noted for producing a very clean lager-like fermentation character, even if it's fermented at 95 degrees Fahrenheit. You've got Hornindal, you've got Voss, all of these great, relatively unique and novel to American brewers, at least, that you can ferment way warmer than anybody ever thought you could ferment a beer at. And because of that temperature, they ferment very quickly. They attenuate really well. So again, you can't talk about quick brewing without talking about Kveikis. But like you said, like I said earlier, there are certain styles that I think maybe you can do certain of, some of these methods and it will work better on that. There are other styles that you can still, employ some of these methods and you're going to get away with something good. I personally will usually do, for example, a 60-minute boil if I'm making a double IPA, just because I want to ensure I'm getting the bitterness in there that I feel that style needs, but I might abbreviate other parts of the brew day to save time. So, well, that is all the time that we've got for this episode. Martin, do you have any final words on your experiences brewing with time constraints?
Yeah, I think just think of the brew day as something that you can fit around your life rather than thinking I need 5 or 6 hours. And my hope is that there is somebody out there who started listening to this podcast as they were beginning their brew day and that they completed their brew day before they got to the end of this podcast.
Well, this episode right now is pushing about an hour and 10 minutes, give or take. So I think that's possible. There's somebody out there listening to this while doing a short and shoddy brew day. And they're wrapping up right now. So, well, don't forget to check out our podcast, The Brew Lab, where host Kate Job takes you into the lab with brewing experts to discuss the fascinating research they're doing on our favorite beverage. And remember to head over to Brülosophy.com to stay current on everything we are up to. The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to Brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/Brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no.